Okay, so we are in the last unit of the year, and this is where we're going to start talking about ecology, and we'll kind of talk about what that means. So this first part is going to be all about the biosphere. So what exactly is ecology? What are we going to be talking about when we talk about this unit? We're going to be talking about the interactions among organisms. So how predator and prey interact and how members of the same species interact. But we're also going to be talking about the interaction between organisms and very importantly, the environment. Okay. So there are a couple of different factors that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about abiotic factor, which are the non-living factors: sunlight, wind, rain, water, soil, those kind of things. And then there are the biotic factors here, so abiotics here, which are anything that's living. So think your food webs, think competition for resources and mates and places to live. Think mating interactions, food interactions, those kind of things. Okay, so there are kind of three really major things in the biosphere, and those are energy, so how energy flows through an environment, and then that's going to involve your producers and your consumers. And this is something that we've kind of talked about regularly as the semester has gone on. So hopefully this is partially a review. So when we talk about our primary producers, we're really talking about autotrophs. So generally that's going to be plants. Sometimes it's going to be things like algae. But a lot of times when we think about the biosphere as a whole, when we think about producers, we're thinking about plants. Then we're going to kind of delve into consumers. So that's going to be kind of everything else. Herbivores are going to consume plants. Primary predators are going to consume herbivores. And then the top predators are going to consume your primary predators. And remember, those are all called heterotrophs. And then one thing we kind of have touched on, but we haven't really talked about in depth, are the idea of our detritivores. And so these are going to be things that are going to decay dead material. So these are going to be things like worms, mushrooms, bacteria that live in the soil. And every time a leaf falls or an animal dies, then their job is to decay all of that dead material. If we didn't have detritivores, to me, those are the most important thing in the ecosystem. If we didn't have those, there would be dead stuff everywhere, right? And we would have no more organic material left because there wouldn't be anything to kind of recycle some of those nutrients into the soil and into plants so that we can kind of start the whole process over again. So we've kind of talked about this before, but I'm sure you've heard both of these terms before from me. But let's kind of talk about the idea of a food chain versus a food web. So a food chain is going to be kind of a linear path from producers. So let's talk about, dinoflagellates, which are kind of they're photosynthetic protists that can make sugar. And then it's a straight line all the way up to the primary or the highest consumer. Okay, so from here it would be dinoflagellates to copepods, which are like mollusks kind of, to fish, to a small shark, to a big shark. A web is going to be much more complex and it's going to be a network. So multiple things can eat other things. So here we've got energy from the sun going to both dinoflagellates and diatoms, and then several things eating those and again eating and eating and eating until we get to the top where we've got things like large sharks like in our food chain, but we've also got smaller sharks, marlin, tuna, those kind of things. So that being said, with with food chains and food webs, how do we know how energy flows in an ecosystem? So we know that each trophic level, so primary is going to be trophic level number one. Those are your producers. Your primary consumers are going to be trophic level number two, secondary, etc. We know that they follow this rule called the 10% rule. And the 10% rule says that about 10% of energy from each trophic level moves up. So, for example, like in this example with our pyramid, we have 10,000 kilocalories of energy in the producer, call it grass, right? Only a 10%, 1,000 kilocalories are going to go to the grasshopper, okay? Because that 9,000 kilocalories are going to be used by the grass to live and reproduce and make more grass, right? So 10% will go to the grasshopper, and then that grasshopper was going to use 90% of the energy to live and be a grasshopper. So 10% will go to whatever eats the grasshopper, which would be, in this case, a frog. So 100 kilocalories, and then 10, and then 1 kilo. So the hawk really does not get that much energy, okay? So it has to kind of eat a lot more, but the snakes are bigger, right? So it can eat 3 or 4 snakes and get the same grams or the same amount of energy to eat a whole bunch of grass, okay? So what I want you to think about, this is something we can kind of talk about in class, is what happens if we disturb one level? Say we take out the frog level. What happens? So this is something I want you to kind of jot down in your notes and think about. So the last thing we're going to talk about is how matter cycles through. So it's really important that matter is cycled within and between ecosystems. And the things that we're going to focus on are water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Water is incredibly important, right? Water is life. But then carbon, carbon is really important for us to make sugars and fats and proteins and that kind of stuff. Nitrogen is really important for making proteins. Phosphorus is really important for making DNA. So it's really important that we recycle those things and they don't get stuck in one of the levels. So first we'll talk about the water cycle, and this is probably something you've already covered before in like maybe 7th or 8th grade. So let's start with precipitation. So when it rains, that rain is going to get collected down into the soil, or it's going to run off into rivers and lakes and streams and that kind of stuff. Theoretically, it will get infiltrated into groundwater, which is down here. And this groundwater is what's going to swell up and feed rivers, lakes, oceans, and streams. And then through evaporation, that's going to go back up into the clouds and feed the rain cycle, okay? We also have living organisms that are part of the water cycle. So trees and plants are going to take up water through their roots and through a process called transpiration, which is something we will talk about more heavily. Through transpiration, water will then come out the pores and leaves and go back into the atmosphere. Carbon cycle, really important. This one is a little bit easier just because we've talked about photosynthesis and respiration before. So sunlight and CO2 are going to go into plants, create organic carbon. And then either animals are going to eat said plants, right, and respire CO2 back into the atmosphere, or those plants are going to die and either, again, become food for mushrooms or bacteria or something, respire CO2, or they die and become fossil fuels, and that takes millions and millions of years. But when they become fossil fuels, then we as humans dig up said fossil fuels and we burn them. And so we use combustion instead of respiration to emit CO2. Okay, so it's really the process of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it back in. Okay, so before the industrial age, this was the only way that we could kind of, or one of really the main way. Now that we've added this in industry way, that is what's caused our CO2 in the atmosphere to skyrocket. So the last one I'm going to talk about are the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, and I kind of combined them. I think it's kind of cool to see them side by side, so I combine them. So there's lots and lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere in the form of N2. And so what's going to happen is N2 is going to come out of the atmosphere and be fixed by bacteria. Okay, and it's kind of like carbon fixation, where we take atmospheric carbon and we create something else. We're going to do the same thing with nitrogen, but bacteria in the soil do that. So they turn it into these really important things that are good for the environment: ammonia, nitrates, nitrites. Some of them will go back to animals. Some animals really like some of those things. Some plants will incorporate some of these things into their proteins, and some of it will become runoff, and then we'll have some bacteria that will denitrify. So we have bacteria that will create these things, ammonia, nitrates, nitrites, and we have some that will break that and put it back into the atmosphere as N2. We also have fertilizer production and animals that either defecate or urinate in the soil, producing ammonia and nitrates and those kind of things. So with phosphorus, we don't have atmospheric phosphorus. The phosphorus in our phosphorus cycle comes from rocks, and they contain phosphates. And if you remember that really important thing, ATP, has 3 phosphates on it. So this is a really, really important thing to recycle because, ATP. So rocks are going to weather and erode, and that phosphorus is going to go into the soil. And then what's going to happen is plants are going to uptake that phosphorus, those phosphate groups, PO4, and incorporate them into their plants. When animals eat the plants and animals eat other animals, then that's how we're passing those phosphates around. And then when things die, bacteria again decompose and put the phosphate back into the soil. So these are very basic explanations, but I think they'll kind of start the conversation of the importance of cycling matter.